So, hello everyone. Has anyone seen this Netflix show, Marie Kondo Tidying Up? So good. So me and the babies and I have been a bit unwell the last week. We're a lot better today, but I've found a little bit of time to watch a few episodes of this, and this is sort of like my guilty pleasure. Other people watch, Andy's guilty pleasure is SVU, the Special Victims Unit, Law and Order. I watch Tidying Up. So if you haven't heard of Marie Kondo, she basically has this, she turns up to people's houses and she has this 4-step process of decluttering and tidying the home. And first step is clothing, and the second step is books and paper. The third step is called kimono, which is basically everything else, so kitchen, garage, and miscellaneous. And then the fourth and final step is sentimental items. And with the first step, she tells people, so with clothing, she tells people to gather all of their clothes from the house and put them on their bed. And she said, it seems a bit counterintuitive because you're making a big mess by doing this, but the point is, you won't realize how much you need to change until you actually see how much stuff you've got. And so it's meant to be this kind of surprising thing. You pile all your clothes in one place and then suddenly you can see that, whoa, okay, I have a problem. This is a problem, we need to deal with this. And as I was reflecting on where we've been in the Romans series so far, it made me think of that first step. So chapter 1 of Romans that we had a few weeks ago, the first step, the first chapter of Romans is all about how we are all trapped in sin and need to be rescued. And if we don't realize this, if we don't take hold of this, the whole rest of the book of Romans and potentially the whole Bible doesn't really make sense. If we have no need to be rescued, then what are we doing? And this is also a reason why the church is growing incredibly well in places where physically there's poverty, and yet in places where it's more wealthy, we don't seem to have the same kind of need for God. At the Abbey last weekend, where we were with a bunch of our young adults, on the final session there was a lady called Alice from Nelson, and she was speaking, she's from Kenya, and she was speaking about how she moved to New Zealand. And when she moved to New Zealand, people said to her, oh, aren't you glad to be in New Zealand? Your children will be safer. You know, look at all the good things that we've got around us. Can't you see the blessing here? And she sort of politely went, oh, yeah, of course, that's lovely. And in some ways, they are physically safer here. But she was saying, in Kenya, above the parched land, there is so clearly evident the hand of God. It is so obvious that they need God and that they embrace God there. Whereas here in New Zealand, she's actually been sent to New Zealand as a missionary back to us because we have so much need here, but we often don't recognize it because our physical needs are met. So step 1, chapter 1 was all about how all are trapped in sin and need to be rescued. Chapter 2 was all about trying to obey the law won't rescue us. So the law being particularly the Old Testament, or the first 5 books, there are 613 different rules in there. And essentially, the idea, I think, was that if you give more rules, then we'll be better off because we'll have more guidance of how to live. Except that more rules just meant more opportunities to break them. And so we didn't really do too well with that. And so the law, in some senses, was good and it helped to teach us how to live, but actually it won't rescue us. People have tried time and time again to follow the law. People are still trying to follow the law of those 613 rules, and it just isn't working. So step 3, God's righteousness, not our righteousness, but God's righteousness, has rescued the world through Jesus. And that's really the pinnacle of our faith. That is Easter, that is what holds us all together. And then finally, the 4th chapter, which is what we're talking about today, is that God's righteousness has rescued the world through Jesus to create a faith-based, multi-ethnic family. And so in this chapter, Paul is talking a lot about Abraham. And probably it's because the Jews that he's talking to, Abraham is the father of the faith. Abraham is this pillar. But what he's pointing out is that Abraham was declared righteous before he was circumcised. And circumcision was the sign of the covenant and the sign of God's relationship with them. And so all of the Jews, in order to be part of God's family, had to be circumcised. But if we look at the Genesis passage that Paul was referring to, it says here, "Then the word of the Lord came to him, 'This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir.' Then he took him outside and said, 'Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness." Abraham, soon to be Abraham, didn't have the law. He didn't know to be circumcised. He didn't know to not eat certain foods. He didn't know all these things, and yet he believed the Lord and was declared righteous. And so in the church in Rome at the time, there was a huge amount of division. There was this group of Jews who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and they were living out their new Christian lives, amazing. And there was this group of Gentiles who had done the same. But there was this big argument around should the Gentiles then follow the law that the Israelites had had for so long, and what should they do? And they were having all these fights over how to live as a Christian, which of course we never do these days. It's always on the same page. And so Paul is talking directly into this broken relationship between the church and saying, even Abraham was righteous before the law because he believed. It's the sense that faith is the center of what we're doing. Now, I've used this story before, but I think it's really, really important to understand this passage and also how we live as Christians in general. This is a story from the Australian outback. So there was a person from America who came to the Australian outback, I think it was in the 80s, and was amazed at the vastness of the outback and the cattle herds that were roaming around. And one of the things that they said to one of the herders there is they said, "How come you don't have fences?" And the person described that, well, actually their property was this big by this big. I don't remember the exact measurements, but the person from America likened it somewhat to Connecticut. So it was an incredibly large area that these cattle were roaming in. And so they said, well, we don't use fences here. We don't build fences. We build wells. Now, for starters, trying to fence an area that large would be incredibly expensive. Like if we have a chat to Donald Trump about building walls and fences, I'm sure he'd agree it's quite expensive. It's very impractical. It doesn't necessarily mean there are no fences. Some areas are strategically fenced off, but in general, fences just they're not practical. They're not gonna work. But instead what they do is they dig a well, and the cattle instinctively know that the well is life. And if they stray too far from the well, then that means potential death. And so they therefore stay nearish the well, and they can build other wells if they want to move them on to different places. And so instead of having a fence-based structure, they have this well-based structure. Now, Jesus, and also Luke in Acts, and also Paul in Romans, have been trying to move the people of God from a fence-based structure to a well-based mission and ministry. And so previously we relied on the law, and if you obeyed the law, you were in, and if you didn't, you were out. And Paul himself, when he used to call himself Saul, was a Pharisee. He was very intent on the law, and he persecuted Christians because they weren't following these laws. They were eating other things. They were doing all sorts of things that they shouldn't have. Didn't make sense to him. He had a fence-based structure, and so that was that. But then God encountered him, and his life changed radically, and he changed to a well model. Now, one thing that's interesting, though, is that this hasn't just happened since Jesus. And so if we have a look at, this is a passage from Deuteronomy, which is part of that law. This is one of the laws. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. Does anyone know, quick quiz question, who in the line of Jesus was a Moabite? Ruth? Yep, very good, Ruth. So Ruth, a whole book in the Bible she gets. Ruth is a story of incredible faith from a Moabite who wouldn't have been allowed in the family of God. So already we're seeing these stories that don't seem to quite match up with the law, because God is realizing, God knows that we need more than just what the law provides. Here's another one. No one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord. A bit gruesome, but essentially eunuchs is what they're talking about. But does anyone know that story of the eunuch? There's another passage, by the way, that talks about foreigners. Foreigners aren't allowed in the assembly either. But there's a story in Acts of Philip as he's travelling along, and he meets an Ethiopian eunuch. And they're travelling along the road together. The Ethiopian eunuch, so firstly, he's travelling to worship God. And he's a foreigner and he's a eunuch. But he is holding a scroll. Does anyone remember what the scroll is? Isaiah, yes, well done, very good. Here's what some of Isaiah says. Let no foreigner who is bound to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people, and let no eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree. For this is what the Lord says, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant, to them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will endure forever. And foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it and who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. So even in Isaiah, before Jesus, there's a sense that God's family is bigger than just the Jews or just the people that can follow the law. We talk a lot in our sermons about how Abraham was blessed to be a blessing. So Abraham, he was the chosen family, he was blessed, but in order that all of the nations would be blessed. And here we have a house of prayer for all nations. It's the same with us as the church today. We receive blessing of God, which is wonderful. We can come and we can worship God. We can join together. We have community with one another. All this is for the purpose that all nations will be blessed. We always need to keep sight of that. This isn't a fence where the fence keeps us in and others out, but instead it's a well where we draw towards it. Incidentally, back to the fence and well analogy, sometimes when they receive cattle from fenced areas that are used to fences, typically the way the cattle behave is they hover around the well at first because the fences gave them security, and without the fences they can feel, not so secure. And so they hover around the well for a while until they start to feel more confident and they start to reach out a little bit more. And this can be the case for us as well. If we stick with a fence-based ministry or mission or view of the family of God, then there's an in and an out. And if you're in, you don't really need to do anything. You're in. That's great. We get this complacency where we can be right on the edge of the fence, but it's fine because we're in. If we have the well, it actually doesn't matter how close you are to the well, it's all about the direction. Are you facing the well or are you moving towards the well? And so I wonder what some of the fences are that we put up. So initially there was the Holy of Holies inside the temple, and that had a curtain by it, and only one priest was allowed in that space. And in fact, they even tied a cord to the priest, so if the priest happened to die in there, they could pull them out without anyone else going in there. It was so holy, and that's where God resided. But when Jesus died on the cross, the curtain was torn from the top to the bottom, recognizing that God was the one that tore it and opened himself up to others. And so it's not just the one priest. So maybe it's more priests. Maybe I'm allowed in the fence. But my theology training is from Laidlaw, not Otago, which is really the prestigious place. So maybe not. Maybe it's not okay. Or maybe it includes us, all of us actually. Maybe it should be opened up to all of us because we've turned up today. And other people, they might be sleeping in, but we are here. And so we're part of the family today. Or maybe it extends out to St. Aidan's because the bishop is there today. And I know that because of the confirmation. And so maybe it includes our brothers and sisters over there. Maybe they're part of this family and they're within the fence. The key thing about fences is that if it's a fence that makes it more difficult to access the well, then it's not a good fence. If there's a fence that helps to direct people towards the well, that could be an okay fence. Not necessarily all fences are bad. Some strategically placed ones can be good, but that's the key. If it makes it harder to access the well, then it's not a good fence. And so I wonder what fences have been put up in our own lives by ourselves, maybe, or maybe by others, or what fences have been put up in our communities. I was chatting with someone the other day who was staying with us, and he said to me, "So what would you have to do to get kicked out of the church?" And I thought to myself, well, it's pretty hard to get kicked out of the church. And then I thought a bit more and I thought, well, but if you did that, or this, or I don't know. And we had this interesting conversation around that of, at what point can you not turn up to our assembly, to our congregational meetings? But also, does that mean that you are then exiled, or does that mean that we still try and seek reconciliation? What kind of fences have been put up for us or for others? And also, what does it mean to be facing the well or drawing towards the well? You could have someone as holy and as high up as the Pope right next to the well, but if they're facing away from the well, things are not going to go well. You could have someone as far away from the well as you can possibly imagine, who knows very little about Jesus and whose life may not reflect the life of Jesus at all at present. But if they're facing towards the well, then they are part of that family of God. So are we facing towards the well? Are we facing away? Are we gathering people as we move towards the well? What does that look like in our lives? This passage from John 7, this verse says, "On the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, 'Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink.'" And so I just want to emphasize today that you may be feeling like you are not worthy. You may be feeling like you haven't attended services enough recently, or like you haven't prayed enough or read your Bible, or perhaps your life hasn't quite reflected what you hoped it would as a Christian. Maybe you don't even know if you'd call yourself a Christian. But just know that the key thing in all of this is if you are facing the well. Are you thirsty? "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink." So I've got some questions for us. Thinking about where in the outback are you positioned, where are you facing, what fences have you seen, but also what would it look like for these fences to be taken down? I laughed this morning at the earlier service. Leon was wandering around the table here. He was playing with the fences and he was taking them off and moving them around, and I thought, it's a little disruptive, but it's kind of adding to the story of taking down the fences. But then he reached in underneath the altar, pulled out a Bible and threw it. And I thought, that's a great moment of family on mission together. But then I thought to myself, he did that, didn't really know what he was doing, clearly wasn't a great thing to do. We don't throw any books, even including the Bible. But then he still came and received communion. And so I think it's important for us to remember that the key here, and I've said it time and time again, but the key is, what direction are you facing? Are you drawing closer to God, or do you want to draw closer to God? Are you thirsty? And I think our communion liturgy says this really beautifully in the beginning, and so listen out for it as we start to do communion soon. But in terms of who we are welcoming to this family, listen to those words. Think about who you think could be included in that as well. Where do you fit? Where do your loved ones fit? What about the people you walk by on the street? Where do they fit in the family of God? Do they feel like they're stuck outside a fence? Or is the table open to them as well?